Hello there and welcome to the Libertarian Listener with me, Chris Wilkinson. This week I've been talking to Dan Heaton about the Dominic Cummings departure, the COVID-19 mass vaccination programme and the lawsuits surrounding the 2020 US presidential election. The first topic of conversation for this week is on Dominic Cummings and his sudden resignation. I've got a quote from the Mirror first of all that says, "The Prime Minister finally lost his patience with Cummings amid lockdown rows and leaks with claims he sensationally banished the guru after being shown unflattering messages that Mr Cummings had sent to Carrie Symonds. The move also saw Mr Johnson oust his longtime spin doctor Cain. The Times reported it was feared the pair would poison the well if they were allowed to remain in their jobs until the end of the year, as initially planned. A Number 10 source said the atmosphere is one of reset and change." So considering that Dominic Cummings has spearheaded several successful campaigns, including the EU Referendum and most recently the 2019 UK general election, do you think Boris was right to get rid of his best tool in the toolbox, and will he come to regret his decision at a future election perhaps?
Did he let him go, or was he leaving of his own volition shortly anyway? The rumour is that Dominic Cummings was going to be leaving at the end of the year, and I think sometimes once you've made that decision that you're going to be doing that, it's sometimes better that you do go, especially considering the sort of shenanigans that go on in political parties and in government, with lots of spads briefing against each other. So perhaps it was best that he did go now. Dominic Cummings was clearly a great strategist and campaign manager, but this is supposed to be a government. It's not simply there to win votes, it's there to actually govern the country. The biggest letdown really from Dominic Cummings leaving, or perhaps he didn't really achieve what he should have achieved in the time that he was there, was I was hoping that he was going to shake up Whitehall, but he doesn't seem to have managed to achieve that at all. I think ultimately, if the Tories do deliver on their promises, which of course will be more difficult now for the financial constraints that they're going to face, perhaps some of which are of their own making, due to the COVID crisis, then I think they will win future elections. And of course, it's 4 years until the next general election, so it's possible that we might find Dominic Cummings coming back as a campaign manager for the next general election. Of course, that assumes that Boris is still Prime Minister at that point.
I've got another quote here, this time from The Independent. "Some in Brussels believe that Mr Cummings was calling the shots on UK Brexit policy and are expecting a shift in emphasis from Mr Johnson. Phillipe Lambert, an MEP who sat on the European Parliament's Brexit committee, had claimed this week that the advisor's departure was probably the sign that Johnson had begun his U-turn and will in the end accept EU conditions for a trade deal. Mr Cummings had previously written on his blog that the UK should be capable of following through on the threat of no deal. So do you think that now that he's gone, a potentially unconstitutional deal with the EU is now much more likely? And what could this amount to in practice in terms of regulatory alignment, close political ties, etc.?
Lord Frost has reiterated his commitment to protecting control of our laws, and ultimately he is the UK's negotiator in these discussions. So I'm confident in his ability. I believe he considered resigning as part of the sort of the vote leave cabal recently, but he seems to be going on with it. So I have a certain level of confidence in that. Obviously, since Cummings and Cain have stepped down, the EU has been going through more posturing, but that's what they're going to do. It's all part of a negotiation, isn't it? And Ireland has certainly been making some noises over the last few days, but ultimately they're the ones actually on their own way that are going to lose out more if there's no deal, or if there are extra barriers to trade because of their relationship with us from a trading perspective. If we do go down the route of too much alignment, simply for the purposes of getting a deal, because we don't really believe that no deal is better than a bad deal, then we might end up with this level playing field situation. And if we do that, that might impinge upon us striking good trade deals with other countries. And it will also cause us problems in terms of the government's levelling up agenda. If they struggle with the trade deals and they struggle with the levelling up agenda, that's really going to damage the current government in terms of its red wall seats. Yeah. So that's not going to be good for the government at all, you know. And of course, also, you know, if there's seen to be a betrayal, that's just going to open things up again for Nigel Farage and others. So the government does need to be really, really careful on this. And what's more, having made a dog's breakfast of the COVID situation, they really need to get some points here, and that is by, you know, sticking to their guns on Brexit. So it does cause some concern, but because of everything around it and the damage that would be done to the Conservative Party in the short and longer term, I do still hold out hope that I think we will get a deal, and I think it will probably be an okay one. You won't be able to satisfy everybody, and I'm sure Nigel Farage will definitely say it's a betrayal because it's in his interest to do so. But, you know, time will tell. At the moment, I think it's just a lot of posturing and negotiation positions being taken.
What with the disarray and paralysis occurring at the top level of government over the past year, do you think that the government can claw its way back and tackle the most immediate issues more effectively now that Cummings has gone?
Not necessarily. I think there's clearly been lots of backbiting amongst these advisors and SPADs and what have you. And I can see there being more jockeying for position by ministers and their SPADs. There's also talk now of Boris going off on this idea of a green agenda, apparently at the behest of the delightful Carrie. So that doesn't bode too well. Really, it needs somebody with vision to get a grip of the government and just to get a grip of matters in the new year, because we're going to need to get out of this mess through deregulation, not through taxation. That is not going to help us at all, whatever Brexit deal or no deal situation we have. So that's what it needs, somebody to get a grip. The question is Boris the sort of person who can actually do that?
Based on his track record, though, I'm a little bit doubtful of his abilities in that respect. If he's taken on policy settings from the left wing, does it perhaps indicate that he's bereft of ideas of the right?
He's perhaps bereft of much in the way of political conviction, to be honest with you. He's somebody who's always liked to be liked. He loves being popular, and I think that sometimes has been his political undoing.
I think it was Margaret Thatcher who said first on the Walden interview in 1989, just after the resignation of the then Chancellor Nigel Lawson, that advisors are there to advise, ministers are there to decide, and we've heard a lot of similar phrases going around. How much blame for the government's issues can be attributed to Dominic Cummings when the responsibility ultimately boils down to the Prime Minister, who during this year and in these circumstances has acted almost dictatorially? He's been lurching for extreme options as a first resort. He's provided processes for problems but never any solutions, and he's gone from U-turn to U-turn on policy and placed convenience over conviction. Is he the real root cause of the problem in this respect?
Boris is a great front man, but he's not a decisive leader. And I think that's probably what we've been needing in this situation. You know, he's much more interested in being popular than making really tough decisions or putting across tough messages, such as, you know, actually we are going to have to deal with this by way of herd immunity. Different extents of doing that, but you know, he went for popularity. When he was Mayor of London, he really relied upon his deputy mayors. He did select reasonably good people, and they were able to do a good job. And he was more of a chairman than a real leader. I think he's become far too reliant upon experts. Yes, you've got the gruesome twosome, but he's also reliant upon ministers like Hancock, who is clearly loving this situation because it puts him right at the forefront of things. And I think he's perhaps relied on Cummings and others too much, who are, again, as I mentioned earlier, perhaps they were looking at opinion polls, focus groups, what have you, rather than looking at what the correct actual way of dealing with this situation was, and actually trying to, do the tough things and perhaps lead the people a bit more, rather than just being led by people who are being scared by the media about things. It's quite possible, and I almost expect it, that unless he really, really shapes up in the next 12 months, I think the Conservatives will probably replace Boris before the next general election.
Right, so now we're moving on to COVID-19 mass vaccination. It's common knowledge that a hero vaccine has been manufactured by big pharmaceutical companies, but the reality is that most people simply won't need it, because for those with strong and functional immune systems, our own bodies provide the best resistance to a virus rather than half-baked and potentially dangerous drugs. So where do you stand on the COVID vaccine?
Well, I suppose a fully tested and effective vaccine is welcome. I'm certainly not one of these anti-vaxxers. I even at my previous employer even got a free flu vaccine every year. So there's a few years there where I actually took the seasonal flu vaccine. Is this going to have been properly tested? You've got to have some concerns about that. I've seen the rollout plan for this. If they're going to give the vaccine to those who work in care homes and those who are obviously in care homes first, and then they'll sort of work their way down the age groups and people who are not in care homes but otherwise have underlying conditions. I think by the time they get to me, I think we'll have achieved herd immunity. So I'm certainly not going to be volunteering for this perhaps not fully tested vaccine, and one which I don't think is really necessary for me. I mean, touch wood, you don't know. But this is essentially just a bad cold. I think that's the truth for most people. So as you say, for vast swathes of the population, they're going to be either completely asymptomatic, or else they're actually naturally immune for whatever reasons. If it helps, great, but I'm not going to be queuing up to take it anytime soon.
One of the things that struck me was, because I obviously have my own social media pages, someone came along and said, you don't really understand herd immunity if you think that by spreading it faster throughout the population, that's somehow going to make us resistant to the virus. And I said, well, hold on a minute, because the virus didn't come here in March this year. It was here last year. So there's already some degree of acquired immunity that's going around that has just been completely overlooked by policymakers and the so-called experts. It's almost like we've been funneled into having this vaccine or tyranny. That seems to be the choice. Essentially,
I think we will see a lot of pressure being put on people, moral pressure. I mean, we've already seen it with people being expected to wear face masks. Some places people are wearing face masks in the street. I've seen people by themselves in cars wearing a face mask.
Yeah,
that doesn't make any sense. I don't have to be a medical doctor to know that makes no sense. So yeah, I can see there being pressure being applied, moral and otherwise, to take this vaccine.
So the Express has said that the vaccine will reportedly be administered in 2 separate doses, 3 to 4 weeks apart, and staff known as vaccine task forces, which doesn't at all sound totalitarian, will be hired to deliver the programme. Family doctors across England could be doling out a vaccine 7 days a week, including on Christmas Day, under Minister's ambitious plans. Health Secretary Matt Hancock is expected to unveil details of the government's mass vaccination programme this week. Are we heading for a situation where we're going to be vaccinated against our wishes, a compulsory vaccination, as the Prime Minister's calling for 100,000 vaccines to be rolled out per day? And what do you think the dangers are in such a policy?
Well, clearly any such policy of that nature will be a huge step for the UK government to implement. I can see it happening in Scotland, to be fair, because the government there is far more draconian. That they want to know what you're thinking in your own home, let alone being allowed out without a vaccine and what have you. So possibly see it happening there, which will be interesting. Any sort of vaccine compulsion is completely against our basic rights, and so would be a horrific thing to try to bring in. I think in England, at least, I think there's more chance of it, of people taking it through coercion rather than through compulsion. So I can see some of the larger businesses just saying, do you know what, for health and safety reasons, you ain't coming into our office or our factory unless you have had this vaccine. So, you can have some sort of COVID passport or something like that. I mean, apart from the obvious issues around just basic human rights, that you shouldn't be forced to have a vaccine, there's also issues, I think, there in terms of personal data. How will people actually know that you've had this vaccine? And the answer is they're going to have to gain access in this very digital world to your medical records, certain aspects of your medical data. So I can see there being some issues there in terms of medical data getting lost. Lots of companies are not so good at protecting the data that they have. So I can see there being some issues there as well. Certainly compelling people to have a vaccine that there are severe concerns about in terms of its efficacy and whether it's been tested properly would just be so draconian as to, it would just be unacceptable. Certainly in England. Scotland may be a different matter.
The Express and Star has said scientists are in a race to get a COVID vaccine ready before Christmas. I don't know why the rush is, because surely if you're going to take the precautions of testing it properly, then there shouldn't be a rush anyway, but there we go. With ministers believing it is the only way to get Britain out of the current cycle of lockdown and other restrictions on personal freedoms. Now, isn't this untrue? Because the lockdown, the social distancing, face masks, all the restrictions on personal freedoms are all government policies that the Prime Minister and his cabinet have chosen to adopt. It's not a necessity, after all. And clearly, now that the evidence is emerging, they've chosen wrongly. So is it the case that the government is the problem and not the cure to the virus, and that the people who got us into this disaster cannot possibly be the people trusted enough to get us out of it?
I did have a little bit of sympathy with the government in March because it was a novel virus and there were some shocking scenes in the media from places like northern Italy. But we should certainly have been released from that original lockdown much, much quicker. And now I think probably Boris Johnson's illness didn't help in that because people don't like to make decisions. And those people who were around him, once he was incapacitated, the actual ministers were not going to make those tough decisions. You see it in business all the time. That unfortunately, whilst we can be critical of this government, and believe you me, I am, most governments around the developed world have, to a greater or lesser extent, instigated lockdowns. So, the world economy is going to take a beating as a result because of the lack of trade, and of course the tourism industry in particular has been devastated. But this holding out for a vaccine is just a really forlorn hope, and we can surely learn to live with what is, I said earlier, is essentially nothing more than a cold for most people. It's not simply this government that's the problem. I'd suggest that probably government is the problem in this instance.
I wouldn't disagree. So the last topic of today is going to be on the 2020 US presidential election. What with recounts and lawsuits being ordered in no less than 6 swing states, and despite the near daily harassment from the mainstream media, is President Trump right not to concede until all legal votes have been counted and officially signed off?
Trump's going to be portrayed in the media as a sore loser. Of course he is. The mainstream media have not treated him particularly well, have they, over the last 4.5 years? And certainly in this instance, he'll be the sore loser, the guy that's squatting at the White House, despite the fact that even if he has lost, he doesn't actually have to leave there until towards the end of January anyway. But I think he's well within his rights to await the recounts. In the UK, recounts in elections are absolutely the standard when the election is close. I mean, just look at Georgia. The difference between Biden and Trump is only 0.3%, and that's well within recount territory. So I think he's absolutely within his rights to do that, and that's before we even get into these issues that are possibly going to the courts in terms of mail-in ballots and some of the lack of transparency in the counting rooms that we've heard about. In 2000, Al Gore went to court when he thought he should really have won Florida, but there were some pregnant chads or something along those lines, and he wasn't particularly criticised by the media. Indeed, later on they lauded him for his environmentalism. I don't know if you've ever had the misfortune to see An Inconvenient Truth, but I wouldn't recommend it. The Electoral College electors, they don't need to officially cast their votes until the 14th of December. So if there is actually any evidence of fraud or the recounts come out with a different result, I think the time should be used, and the courts are there to be utilised if there is actually any evidence of wrongdoing.
Do you think that the Trump campaign's claims of election tampering hold some ground, considering the Republicans have maintained their majority in the Senate and they've actually gained seats overall in the House of Representatives, yet they've lost the Electoral College votes? And do you think that, assuming claims of rigging are found to be untrue, the upcoming Biden administration would suffer from immediate political weakness, paving the way to a potential Trump victory in 2024?
In terms of the shenanigans, does it look dodgy? Yeah, at first sight. I think it's quite possible that people will have voted for Biden, or indeed for the Libertarian Party candidate, Joe Jorgensen, for the presidential election, because they simply don't approve of Donald Trump. But they may well have still voted for the Republican candidate for the House or the Senate. That's quite possible. Given the lack of the blue wave that the Biden administration was hoping for, then he may very well not be able to push through some of his more, or perhaps I'm going to say his more extreme measures. Perhaps it's Kamala Harris or the squad's more extreme measures, perhaps more than Biden's. I'm not so sure he knows what the words mean really, unless of course he decides to or is persuaded to use executive orders rather than actually passing legislation through Congress. Which then means that we're then going to have to look to the courts, aren't we? And of course, there's currently a Conservative majority now in the Supreme Court, so they may inhibit Biden somewhat, unless again he's persuaded to try to pack the court by the more rebellious members of the Democrat Party, sort of AOC, and to a lesser extent Kamala Harris herself. I mean, the whole thing, there is a stench around this because of the mail-in ballots. There's always issues with postal votes, and obviously with these mail-in ballots where they can turn up after election day in some states, which is just craziness. I think if that stench lingers, then it will be a problem for Biden and the Democrat Party. I don't think Trump will actually stand again in 2024, but I do think the GOP may look for someone who's a more acceptable face of the Republican Party, but perhaps with some more Trumpian instincts than perhaps they would have done in previous electoral cycles. We
could, of course, be wrong as well, and we could be seeing Donald Trump in for another 4 years come Inauguration Day. What do you think would happen in the next 4 years if Trump got back in?
Well, clearly the first thing that would happen is that the Antifa lot will probably start kicking off. Should that simmer down, there'll be some interesting investigations, wouldn't there, in terms of the fraud? Because I suspect, for him to get back in, there's going to have to be evidence of fraud. he might win one or two recounts, and that will make it closer. But actually, there needs to be, I think, quite a few fraud cases for him to get the overall Electoral College votes, which means that there's been widespread fraud. So that would be a huge scandal, I think, for the Democrat Party, which will undermine them for years to come. That's only going to happen though if the evidence is there, and it's quite possible that, hey, it's all completely legit, it just looks weird, or they're just very good at covering their tracks. If Trump does get back in, it's probably a little bit better for Britain in terms of a post-Brexit trade deal, but I suppose we may have already potentially bound our hands in any such trade negotiations by then, depending on the timing of all these things and whether we've signed up to a bad deal with lots of alignment with the EU. So it's not a great time. It would have been, from a pro-Brexit perspective, probably better for Trump to win. Doesn't mean we can't do a trade deal with America, as long as Biden, is sensible and doesn't sort of try to play too many games. So I'm confident, still remain confident about Brexit from our perspective, whoever actually wins, because I think a good trade deal is still possible with America.
Only time will tell in that respect.
It always does.
All right, it's been great talking to you, Dan.
It's been a pleasure.
Lovely. Now we're handing over to 5 Minutes with Ed.
Hello there and welcome to 5 Minutes with Ed on the Libertarian Listener. My name's Ed Saunders and yours isn't. Since we last spoke, the government has again, it's unleashed Lockdown 2, Electric Booga, that word that we can't say for legal reasons, otherwise YouTube will have us taken down, or either that or we'll be denounced as some sort of far-rightists. But yes, indeed, so they have rescinded our God-given rights for the second time in a year. It seems like they're getting quite good at it by this stage. A small amount of people kind of joined up in terms of the rebellion, but it really wasn't anything significant, which is highly disappointing. It appears as though Steve Baker MP is leading a rebellion within the Conservative Party, with potentially up to 70 MPs signed up to rebel if the government decides to extend the lockdown past the 2nd of December. Having said that, it is looking fairly likely. As we've seen in the past, they seem to drip feed us this information in small manageable quantities so that we can come to terms with it really with ourselves before they actually implement said policies. Rishi, the quote ATM unquote Sunak, has decided to extend the furlough till March, and to be honest, if they weren't planning on shutting down the economy completely, I really don't see any reason why that would be necessary, but yes, we'll see how it plays out. All I'm saying is I haven't got a great amount of money on the fact that we're going to be able to enjoy a family Christmas. The Anglican Church in England has done what they do best, which is not actually following the Bible, in that the Archbishop, and I think it was actually the General Synod, asked to be shut down. Apparently, worship online is just as valid, given even despite all the scripture which kind of points completely the opposite way. Having said that, it seems to be the business of the Church of England these days to pretty well just go with what the government wants instead of, civil society in general, instead of actually holding faith. But there we go. You can either, when you merge church and state, as we do in this country, you can have one of two things. Either the church takes supremacy or the state does. They have to get along in some way, and it seems that with our society, the church has kind of fallen in the leeway to the wants and wishes of the state. Now, in the past week, a Labour MP from Wales had suggested that how can the sale of fireworks be morally justified during a pandemic? I'm assuming it's just kind of part of a crusade against people having any sort of fun, given that last year she tried to justify it over animal rights concerns, and I think it was something else the year before. She evidently doesn't like things that go bang, although to be honest, that's pretty well all politicians. I know you have like small aerial exploding shells that go bang and make a pretty colour. I was unaware that they had actually been, manufactured in a slightly different way, which turned them into biological weapons, dispersing the COVID-19 virus onto any bystanders and livestock and so forth. It appears that people have been unaware of this whilst purchasing them, which is probably why the rates have gone up so significantly. But we will see, won't we? To be honest, in my opinion, I don't think that we should have been celebrating the fact that Guy Fawkes was captured. Really, Guy Fawkes was probably one of the last people to go into Parliament with honest intentions, under Parliament with honest intentions, and actually, in terms of his policies, with the Parliament that we have presently, I think I'm pretty well aligned with him. Well, I don't like to use the term drain the swamp, but you know, maybe shove the swamp about 400 feet in the air. But it seems weird that the government is, an anti-bonfire night, given the fact that it was actually at the time someone plotting to bring down the government of the day by blowing it sky high. Then again, let's face it, in terms of them having historical context and precedent in their minds whilst making decisions, that's not something which exactly Boris Johnson's current Conservative administration is is famous or particularly adept in doing. But there we are. And to round it all up, quite interestingly, there is a hashtag on social media which appears to be trending at the moment, and the hashtag is Arrest Matt Hancock. Now, this is not exactly, I doubt it's likely to happen. I think the people that have bought the suit are a bit wishful in their legal thinking, but it's quite funny. I do encourage everyone to go onto Matt Hancock's Facebook page and just read all of the the hilarious comments which people are putting. I don't really quite know on what grounds it is based, but I don't think it's anything that's going to have any mileage in it. Having said that, it just makes me chuckle, is all I'll say. And if it were to happen, it's not something, you know, that I'd be opposed to, but there we are. We can all have our hopes and dreams, can't we? Even in Britain. And that was Ed's 5 minutes. That did go quickly, didn't it? I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.
And that's all we have time for this week on the Libertarian Listener. Don't forget that we're on social media, and check out our website, thelibertarianlistener.com. And until next week, thanks for listening.